So in Screencast 2, we're going to consider price of the activity, of the good or service, as a determinant of quantity demanded. So when we talk about price of activity, we're talking about consumers' willingness to pay. And price is considered a major determinant of demand because effective demand is the amount consumers are willing to buy by paying the market price. So when we talk about effective demand, we're talking about in economics the fact that we have a notional demand curve, and where price is set and hits the demand curve, this shows us the amount that consumers are willing to pay or buy at a given market price. So effective demand is revealed demand, the actual demand which we can see at a particular given price. And economics shows us that usually the relationship between an increase in price and quantity demanded is a negative one, i.e. as price increases, demand decreases. So demand is highly dependent on price. Okay, so there are some issues in estimating the price of sport, and the prices for composite commodities are more difficult to identify because composite commodities are made up of a parent demand and a derived demand. So this means that there are different elements to the price. There is the price of entry to participate in your given sport, but then sports will also have costs associated with time, the amount of time that is required to travel to and participate in the particular sport. And we looked at the importance of time last week. But there may also be, for many sports, costs in buying equipment, buying clothing, which is required to actually participate in that sport. Okay, so if we think about this, we can then understand that as well as being a composite commodity, sports activities also have a composite price made up of fixed costs and variable costs. Now, fixed costs in economics terms and finance accountancy terms are those costs which do not vary as activity changes or increases. So let me give you an example of this. If you buy some sports equipment, that is a one-off fixed cost, and you do not incur additional fixed costs whether you participate once a year, 5 times a year, 10 times a year, 20 times a year. Fixed costs are associated with those costs which you have committed to buy the equipment for your activity, but you don't incur additional costs by participating more. You don't incur additional fixed costs by increasing your frequency of participation. Variable costs, on the other hand, are those costs which are associated with frequency of participation. So variable costs could be the entrance costs to a facility to play your sport. You may have your equipment which you bring with you, which you've already paid for, and therefore there is no marginal or variable cost to add to those. But each time you pay an entry fee, that is a variable cost. Yeah. Each time you travel to the venue, there is a variable time cost. So sports activities have fixed costs and variable costs. So I'll start off by giving you a couple of examples, and then you might want to think about some examples of your own. So what's an example of a sport with relatively high fixed costs? Well, an example of a sport with relatively high fixed costs could be golf. And let's talk about a golf club where you pay a membership fee rather than participating in golf where you pay green fees on a pay and play basis. So your fixed costs are really quite high. You have the costs of golf clubs, which are a fairly expensive investment, and you also have your membership fees, which you pay once a year, which are also typically quite high. So this has high fixed costs. The variable costs then are, by comparison, much lower. And the real cost to a golfer is the amount of time it takes to play 9 or 18 holes, which can be a considerable amount of time, but the actual variable costs can be relatively small. So they might include travel time and travel cost to travel to the golf course, and there may be associated kind of secondary spending, including food and drink at the clubhouse. Okay, those are variable costs, and those are discretionary variable costs as well. An example of a sport with relatively low fixed and variable costs could be running. So running, for example, the fixed costs are relatively low because once or twice a year, depending on the mileage you run, you might invest in a pair of running shoes. You might invest in some running clothes, but that's reasonably low cost. And then the variable costs, well, there's the time spent running, but the actual financial cost of running, if you're running in parks or roads, is actually fairly low. So what you could do now is just spend a few minutes, pause this screencast and think about some examples of sports with high fixed costs and low variable costs. And you could think this could include sport spectating, if you like, and you could think about sports with low fixed costs and high variable costs. So maybe now pause this screencast for a couple of minutes and just try to think about some examples which meet those two criteria. So what's the value then of understanding fixed and variable costs in helping us understand quantity demanded? So frequency of participation and the variable cost of participation, there could be a relationship between variable cost and frequency of participation. So if we think about the variable cost of supporting the England football team or a national football team, this will incur some overseas travel, right? So the fixed costs are negligible of supporting your national team and might include buying the team kit, the top to wear. But all the costs in this kind of sport consumption are variable, and the costs could be really high. So travelling abroad would incur flying costs, flight costs or transport costs, hotel costs, food and drink costs, annual leave and time away from work costs. So this is not something that most people would do very frequently because of the cost. A sport with a relatively low variable cost, such as swimming or such as running, then finance really is unlikely to be a major constraint, and therefore the frequency of participation is likely to be higher. Also, visits to the gym, they have a fixed cost element, but the variable cost is little or zero apart from time. And if we look at sports like running, swimming and going to the gym, and particularly running and going to the gym, they have some of the highest frequencies of participation. And overall, this can lead to a higher volume of overall demand. Yeah, so we have a reasonably large percentage of the population taking part in running, in swimming and going to the gym, and the relatively low variable costs means that that high proportion or reasonably high proportion of the population who do the sport also do it quite frequently, which generates so the demand for the sport generates a relatively high volume of frequency in terms of derived demands for visits to sports facilities, for purchase of sports clothing and equipment. So it is important to understand fixed and variable costs because it does have a bearing on overall quantity demanded. The other thing I want to talk to you about in terms of price is the concept of price elasticity of demand. Now, this looks at the relationship between quantity demanded and price. And price elasticity of demand measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price. Now, usually, as we've said, this is a negative relationship. Yeah. Usually there is a negative relationship between price and demand because as price increases, demand decreases. Therefore, price elasticities are normally negative. And we measure price elasticity of demand using the formula here where we divide the percentage change in quantity demanded by the percentage change in price. Now, the way that a sports good or service reacts to price change shows us different levels of elasticity of demand. So what we can see here is we have a chart which shows us demand, the demand schedules or the demand curves for two different goods. This is a demand curve which is showing what's called elastic demand. Yeah. And what this means is that if we move across, if we change price here, so if we were to kind of have a price set here, this will give us demand here on the quantity axis. If we increase prices, we can see that the change in quantity demanded is not as significant as for the inelastic, the inelastic curve. So the inelastic curve shows us that actually quantity demanded is not so responsive to changes in price. The steepness of this curve shows us that a change in price does not result in as drastic a change in quantity demanded as does a change in price on the elastic demand curve. Okay, so what we're saying here is that goods which show elastic demand are more sensitive to changes in price. Goods which show inelastic price elasticity of demand are less sensitive to changes in price. So, price elasticity of demand, if we have a relationship between change in price and quantity demanded, which is greater than 1, using the formula on the page here, then this indicates elastic demand, i.e. demand is sensitive or responsive to a change in price. Okay, if price elasticity is less than 1 or less than -1, this indicates inelastic or unresponsive demand. So typically football tickets and football pricing is seen as being relatively price inelastic. So demand is relatively price inelastic for football tickets because the evidence is that prices have increased and increased and increased often well beyond the retail price index rate of price increases, and often beyond the rate that incomes are increasing, so that they're taking up a bigger share of an individual's income, but demand is still strong for tickets at football grounds in England, as evidenced by attendance figures. They've held up very well as ticket prices have actually increased. Okay. So, what are some of the factors affecting price elasticity of demand? Well, one of these is the availability of substitutes. The more products there are available to replace some products, then the more price elastic, or the higher the level of price elasticity you are likely to see as consumers are more able to switch to other products. So this is very close again, isn't it, to Porter's 5 forces and the threat of substitutes. If there are substitutes available, Porter's 5 forces says, then this limits the availability of firms to increase prices to raise profits, because people can easily switch to a substitute. So we've seen and we've talked about how budget gyms have been a substitute for mid-market gyms. We can also see that during lockdown, in the early phases of coronavirus, when gyms were forced to close, that there were substitutes in terms of online classes, the Joe Wicks phenomenon, and people running and cycling instead. Although interestingly, just yesterday I saw a bulletin come out from Sport England in the Active Lives survey, which says that in the early stages of lockdown, participation decreased very significantly in England. So, there may have been some substitutes for some consumers, but overall, the overall level of demand did decrease. But anyway, the availability of substitutes and the closeness of those substitutes, how good the substitute is in replicating the experience or the utility that was derived from the original product, will determine elasticity of demand. Because as Porter's 5 forces tells us, if you know that there are close substitutes and they are readily available, people are more likely to switch if you increase prices to raise income and raise profitability, which is part of the attractiveness of the industry according to Porter's 5 forces. If you do that, the threat of substitutes is high. Yeah. And so there's really a good crossover here between this concept and the concept that you will be looking at, or will have been looking at, in international sports strategy. Another factor is the degree of necessity. Essential products are generally inelastic. I suppose one of the problems with this is when it comes to sport, different people will have different views about just how essential a good or a product is. Some people will see the season ticket for their football team as being absolutely essential. Yeah? So a highly dedicated supporter, that will be the last thing, or one of the last things that they will stop buying. It will be seen as an essential. For some people, the gym membership and going to the gym will be seen as absolutely essential. But for others, they may be far less committed and far less likely to adhere to their going to the gym if prices increase beyond a certain level, or far less likely to buy football tickets if prices increase above a certain level. Although for many people, sport is increasingly being seen as a necessity, as part of their life and something that they value. Okay. And another factor is the proportion of income spent. Generally, the higher the proportion of income, the more elastic the product, while those that only take up a small proportion of income are inelastic. So in terms of consumer decision making, we require more information, we require more reassurance that major purchase decisions are going to be the right purchase decisions, and we weigh the value, the utility of those more heavily than we do frequent low cost purchases. So for example, therefore, in the current economic climate, people may consider the cost of travelling abroad to support a national football team than they would to consider the price of paying for a swimming admission at a local leisure centre. So there is evidence, that the proportion of income spent, if it's a high cost item, that is generally more price elastic, while those which take up a small proportion are income inelastic. So that concludes what I want to say about price. At the end of the workbook for this week's sessions, you'll see that I've put some reading and further reading for you to do, which we will discuss in the seminars in week 6. Now, some of the readings relate to price elasticity of demand for different goods and services. I'll talk to you more about those at the end of the screencasts, but there is further reading to be done about the role of price in determining demand for both participation sports and professional and spectator sports. So that we will come back and look at these in more detail, but I've just tried to give you the theory, and we'll look at some of the applications of these to both participation and elite sports in the seminar in week 6. Now, Screencast 3, having discussed price, we're going to actually consider the effect of changes of income on quantity demanded.